was invited here 2 years ago, and the last time what I spoke about was the likely scenarios for what's going to happen in Syria. I said, first of all, that because of the inner core of the Syrian regime was bound together by ties of sect and kinship, it is unlikely to fragment like the regimes did in Libya or Yemen, or turn on each other like the regimes did in Egypt or Tunisia. And since it and its main constituency come from a minority Alawite community, it truly believes that its only choices are to fight to the bitter end or to face annihilation. Because the opposition is so fractious, it's unlikely to prevail. That being said, however, it is improbable that the regime will be able to uproot it entirely from its bases in the countryside and in the border areas. And finally, as I shall discuss in a moment, the international community prefers failed states to divided states. It is therefore the most likely endgame for the Syrian civil war is what UN and Arab League Special Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi once called the Civilization of Syria. In other words, Syria would still hold a seat at the United Nations, but its territory will be parceled out amongst the government and its supporters, various armed militias, including the Islamic State, and Syrian Kurds, each of which would jealously guard its domain and enviously eye the domains of others. That's what I said last time, and I still hold to it that that is the most likely endgame. But as baseball player and sage Yogi Berra once said, predictions are difficult, particularly about the future. The only chance for a negotiated settlement is if the United States and Iran pull off what's called the grand bargain. It means that instead of negotiating about Syria or about nuclear weapons, that the United States and Iran put all their outstanding issues on the table at once. Nuclear talks, Syria, Iraq, IS, etc. This will make it easier for either side to make trade-offs. But this is an extraordinarily unlikely scenario because of hardliners on both sides. Hardliners on the Iranian side, for example, and of course, Rand Paul in the United States. Today what I want to do is to discuss the three big ticket items that have affected the region since the last time I spoke here. Those three items are sectarianism, challenges to the post-World War I state system, and the challenge to the nation-state idea itself. First, let's start off with sectarianism. Sectarianism becomes a factor in politics whenever some political entrepreneur finds it to be a useful tool to achieve political goals. That entrepreneur might be a government, it might be a foreign power, or it might be an individual or a group. In the contemporary Middle East, all three have played a role. There are four factors behind the current state of sectarianization that has taken place within the Middle East. First, the process that I described last time, a common government practice called coup-proofing. As I explained last time, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, etc. In all those places, rulers have brought into their inner circle only those bound to the ruler or ruling dynasty by ties of kinship, sect, or regional affiliation. This process ensures their loyalty, and particularly the loyalty of those who are in coup-critical positions. It also identifies a regime with a particular sect, usually a minority sect, such as the Alawites in Syria. Now this has had two effects. First, it forces the minority community to which the ruler belongs to circle its wagons around the regime when the regime is threatened, as is currently happening in Syria. Secondly, the regime identifies its opponents in sectarian terms and acts as if this was really the case. This forces the opposition, in turn, to make itself into a sectarian opposition. The second factor behind the sectarianization of politics in the region is the spillover from the Syrian Uprising. For example, the fact that Hezbollah has provided crucial support for the Syrian government has provoked a very strong reaction among Lebanese Sunnis, who tend to support the opposition. And the Turkish government's anti-Assad stance, along with the influx of tens of thousands of mostly Sunni Syrian refugees, has touched a sectarian nerve among Turkish Alevis and Alawites. The third factor behind the current sectarianization of politics in the Middle East has to do with the deliberate policy of IS, the Islamic State. Like its precursor, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, but unlike Al-Qaeda Central, the Islamic State is a Takfiri movement. It pronounces Muslims who do not hold on to its strict doctrine, such as majority Shi'i population in Iraq, non-believers, and thus rendering them suitable for killing. IS would have been a petty annoyance were it not for the anti-Sunni policies of Nouri al-Maliki in Iraq, who adopted the coup-proofing techniques of his predecessor, Saddam Hussein. Al-Maliki's policies encouraged large numbers of Sunnis, Iraqi Sunnis, to regard the movement as liberators, or at least to regard it sympathetically. The final reason for the recent spate of sectarianism in the region is the Saudi-Iranian competition. The competition is, in fact, a geostrategic competition. It has nothing to do with sectarianism at all. Each views winning and holding allies in the region as a zero-sum game. The geostrategic reality, however, has not prevented both sides from presenting their competition in sectarian terms, or trolling for allies amongst fearful or aggrieved Sunnis or Shi'is throughout the region. Now, what does this all mean for the future of the region? Historically, once sectarianism has been introduced into an area, it has been virtually impossible to eradicate it. As a matter of fact, there's not one instance in the Middle East where sectarianism in a state has been eradicated. And there are two reasons for this. First, geography. Secondly, politics. In terms of geography, space becomes segregated. Members of religious communities seek the relative safety of numbers by removing themselves from mixed environments. We have seen this in the past in Lebanon, Iraq, and currently in Syria. It's difficult to remember back to the time before 2003 when, for example, 1/3 of the marriages in Iraq were between Shiis and Sunnis. Now, Shiis and Sunnis have little opportunity to mix with each other, therefore, that's a phenomenon that probably of the past. In terms of politics, once conflict ends, minority communities demand set-asides to assure their protection and proportional representation in government and administration. You can bet that in the unlikely event of a political solution to the Syrian civil war, Alawite rights will be addressed in specific terms in whatever constitution they sign on to. The second problem that I want to address is a challenge to the post-World War I state system. It's usually conflated with the problem of the misnamed Sykes-Picot boundaries. The only other person who has gotten as bad a reputation from misnaming as Mark Sykes and George Picot has been poor Arthur Balfour, who got the work of the British cabinet pinned on his name alone. My argument here is simple. Rather than viewing the Middle East as the Middle East state system as fragile and a source of instability, the Middle East state system has been remarkably resilient for more than 50 years, or at least since the British withdrawal from the Gulf in 1971. There are two reasons this is the case. First, although there are weak states in the region which might not survive the current strife, and I'm thinking specifically of Yemen and Libya, states in which ethnic and sectarian attachments compete with and may even trump national attachments at the present time, such as Syria and Iraq, throughout most of the region, national attachments have grown stronger over the past 7 decades. There are two reasons for this as well. First, the passage of time. For upwards of 70 years, most states in the region have engaged their citizens in common practices, have assiduously cultivated national identities, hence the death of Pan-Arabism. The second reason the state system has been relatively stable over the past half century has been support for that system that has been provided by both regional and outside powers. Both regional and outside powers lend support to the state system to maintain the regional balance of power, to prevent outsiders from gaining a foothold in the region, such as what America did during the Cold War in trying to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining a foothold, and to assure the uninterrupted flow of oil. The final reason, of course, is the fact that for some reason or other in the post-World War II world, we like to uphold the rule that national boundaries should be inviolable. Now, true, the uprisings have complicated this picture somewhat. It is possible that Yemen and Libya might be allowed to splinter. This demonstrates their marginal importance to the regional and international order. It's also interesting that it is the southern part of Yemen that might splinter, not the northern part, the part that's far away from Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, it is unlikely that the international community will countenance the breakup of Syria or Iraq. Too much is at stake, from the Syrian-Israeli conflict to the problems of regional and to the problems caused to international and regional powers that an irredentist Kurdish state would cause. As I said then, for Syria, the most likely solution or the most likely outcome is Somalization, becoming like Somalia, where nobody really has control of the entirety of the country. Iraq, too, will probably escape fragmentation. Instead, it is entirely possible that Iraq's future lies in the regionalization of the country. The central government is likely to have limited control over outlying areas, and those areas will be organized into regional units, which the Constitution allows. We have already seen this take place in the Kurdish regional government, to which might be added a Sunni and Shia regional governments as well, ruling over autonomous areas with unstable borders. The third problem that I want to address is a challenge to the nation-state system, or nation-state idea itself in the Middle East. Now, it was al-Qaeda that originally put this issue on the table. According to the core al-Qaeda ideology, the, quote, Crusader Zionist conspiracy introduced the nation-state system into the Islamic world to keep the Islamic world weak and divided. Al-Qaeda, therefore, has sought to eliminate the system and operates as if there are no borders in the region. Hence the names that are given to the al-Qaeda affiliates that reflect regional and not national designations. Al-Qaeda in Islamic North Africa, for example. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Al-Qaeda in the, what's usually translated as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is actually not what Al-Qaeda in Iraq calls itself. It calls itself Al-Qaeda in Bilad al-Rafidin, or in the land between the two rivers. Okay? Again, a regional designation. However, in a world organized according to the principle of the nation-state, it is virtually impossible to conceptualize a workable alternative to the nation-state, much less organize one. Hence, al-Qaeda's vagueness when it comes to defining what their future caliphate might look like. Most of the leadership has, as a matter of fact, punted on the issue. And having read tens of thousands of pages of al-Qaeda material, my head started spinning backwards. I only found one mention by bin Laden of a caliphate, which was extraordinarily vague. But strange things have happened on the road to establishing al-Qaeda's caliphate. At least one of its official affiliates, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and many of its imitators, like the various Ansar al-Sharias, seem to have accepted the idea that their struggle would only take place within the context of their individual nation states. Thus, Jabhat al-Nusra defines itself as a Syrian jihadi organization. And the names of the various Ansar al-Sharias are basically contradictory with al-Qaeda policy. There is an Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, which calls itself, remarkably, Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia. Another in Libya, which calls itself Ansar al-Sharia in Libya. So much for a world without borders. Then there is a problem of the Islamic State, which seems to defy the nation-state system by setting up a caliphate that includes parts of Syria and Iraq, but hasn't. First of all, the Islamic State has yet to define what it really is all about. It really has never defined its caliphate. For the moment, it really doesn't have to, considering its focus is on expanding and holding on to the territory that is under its control. Second, other anti-systemic movements have not fared very well, or have either been destroyed or forced to adopt the nation-state's form in the last 100 years in the Middle East. The 19th century Mahdist movement, for example, of Muhammad Ahmed of the Sudan, fits into the former category. The early 20th century Wahhabi movement in Arabia fit into a situation in which it was not destroyed, but had to adopt the status of a nation-state. Third, the caliphate, despite its rhetoric, already has taken on the trappings of an ordinary nation-state, if a particularly vicious one. It issues passports. It has maintained social services associated with the nation-state. It has drawn borders. It even plans to issue its own currency in the form of gold, silver, and copper coins. Finally, the reestablishment of a caliphate does not provide a real challenge to the nation-state form in the region, simply because the future of the Islamic State is not all that bright. The Islamic State is members of the Islamic State are relatively small in numbers. The Islamic State is stretched over a large swath of territory. The Islamic State is deeply unpopular wherever it rules. The Islamic State is dependent on support of former Baathists and tribal leaders who only seem to support it for tactical reasons. In other words, because the Islamic State is fighting against what they believe to be Shi'i domination. The Islamic State is fighting on multiple fronts against multiple enemies. Most recently, of course, there's been bombing by the Iranians as of yesterday or 2 days ago. In short, Obama repeated George W. Bush's mistake by exaggerating the threat the Islamic State poses to the region and to the rest of the world, and thus puffing up its importance. Thank you.